Well, thank you for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be able to come and talk about William Henry Fox Talbot and the collection of photographs that we have in the National Science and Media Museum in Bradford, which I'll be talking about more about tomorrow. But today, I want to talk about one of the large parts of his collection, his printing collection that exists within our museum. So I'll just start. After a long career spent researching, writing, and taking care of the printing collection at the British Museum, the emeritus keeper of the Department of Prints and Drawings, Anthony Griffiths, recently published his long-awaited treatise on the history of image printing. In the Print Before Photography, and you'll see where I'm borrowing the title from my talk here, Griffith maps the history of visual reproductive technologies from the 16th to the 19th centuries, from the woodcut to the lithograph. The announcement of the invention of photography in 1839 for Griffiths is a dividing point for the printed image. Later photographic processes, particularly the halftone process and offset lithography, signaled the demise of handcrafted image reproduction technologies. This presentation looks to blur these boundaries between photography and engraving by focusing on the photographic printing work of one of the canonical inventors of the medium, William Henry Fox Talbot. The division between photography and printing is not isolated to print historians. In the recent volume Photography and Its Origins by Tanya Sheehan and Mario Zavignin, Stephen Bann has reminded us of a critical division in the history of photography, especially when it comes to narratives surrounding the invention of photography. The history of photography, Bann writes, has tended to be written as an unstated product of exclusions. For example, photography is not printmaking. 19th century photography does not include reproductive photography. Photographic history, Bann argues, has prioritized the chemical image, the image produced by the action of sun alone, over the image reproduced in ink. And this is what I want to argue against. This narrative divide is reflected in both the scholarship surrounding the invention of the positive-negative process by Talbot, as well as in how Talbot's collection is catalogued and held in the National Science and Media Museum in Bradford. Talbot is often remembered and celebrated for his invention of the positive-negative process, certainly a critically important invention or innovation in the history of photography. But what we don't always remember is that Talbot also worked on and off for at least 2.5 decades, inventing and improving an etching-based photographic printing process, which he called Photoglyphic Engraving. Recent scholarship, particularly the important volume William Henry Fox Talbot, Beyond Photography, edited by Miriam Brucius, Chitra Ramalingam, and Katrina Dean, has been expanding the Talbot universe to include his range of scientific work throughout his life, so not just photography. And Larry Schaff's chapter, in particular in this volume on Talbot's photoglyphic engraving work, has brought to light the scale and importance of Talbot's work in this area. Yet there still remains a belief, to borrow Bann's language, that photography is not printmaking, or at least that chemical and ink photographs are distinct categories. These boundaries, moreover, are not only historiographical, but they are reflected in the collection of Talbot's work held in the National Science and Media Museum. While we know a lot about the approximate 5,000 negative and positive images that are in our collection, we don't know very much about the equally large collection of prints, engraving plates, and printing frames that are held in our collection. So this is just a snapshot of all of the prints and engraving plates that are currently in our collection, not yet fully cataloged and certainly under-researched. Through this presentation, I want to ask the following questions. What happens when we include Talbot's work in engraving in his broader experimental practice? How does our conception of the history of photography change when we erase the boundaries between the original and the reproductive image? Okay, so to what exactly is photoglyphic engraving? Talbot's interest in the capacity for metal plates to be engraved with photographic positive is peppered, which is the basis of photoglyphic engraving, is peppered throughout his notebooks in the period just following the publication of his books of tipped-in paper photographs, The Pencil of Nature, which you'll all be familiar with. On July 1st, 1846, Talbot wrote in his notebook, "Take a clean copper plate, wash a printed page with ammonia, blot, put on copper plate. It makes a very clean image of the printing invisible except when breathed upon." You can imagine the materiality of him actually breathing on a metal plate here. "Try if a printed page wash with solution of chloride silver in hypo," hypo being one of the more important chemical solutions for the invention of photography, "would print silver letters on a copper plate negatively. The plate might then be etched with acid." By 1851, Talbot was working on his experiments in earnest, attempting to etch photographs on copper and on steel, and by 1852, he had applied for a patent for his new invention, which he called photoglyphic engraving. He would again apply for a second patent in 1858 on the improvements of this technology. The innovation that Talbot made here was the combination of a long-standing technique of etching with the realization, forwarded by Mungo Ponton in 1839, that potassium bichromate could be made to be photosensitive. Larry Schaff, in Sun Pictures Catalog 12, describes the process of creating these etchings in the following way. The first step involved taking a photographic positive and a metal plate which had been finely polished. On the plate, Talbot would layer an emulsion of gelatin and potassium bichromate. Once the emulsion was dried, he would then place the positive image against the prepared metal plate and place them both in a glass-fronted frame, with wooden screws on the back so that the pressure between the positive and the plate could be adjusted. The frame was then placed in direct sunlight, creating a new direct exposure of the positive onto the gelatin which sat on the metal plate. Where sun had reached through to the positive image, the gelatin would become hardened, and the remaining softened gelatin could be washed away, creating a negative image on the plate. Talbot then brushed the plate with 3 decreasing solutions of acid and water, which would bite the plate, placing small etchings into the area of the metal which did not have any gelatin. This final aspect of the process was exactly the same as traditional etching, which typically used wax and hand-drawn lines on a plate rather than gelatin and photochemistry to produce the image. Once the plate was etched, ink was rolled onto the surface of the plate and wiped clean with a soft blade. The recesses, which had been etched, would retain the ink, and when pressed against a piece of paper and put through a roller press, a positive ink photograph would be produced. One of the important takeaway points about this printing process is that up to the point of inking the plate, photoglyphic engraving is a photomechanical process and a photochemical process, which incorporates the traditional process of etching. Moreover, for Talbot, his work in producing photoglyphic engravings ended once he produced his metal plates. The actual printing of the plates in ink was left to professional printers. In the earlier period of his experimental practice, the printer he relied on for guidance and for printing his plates was George Barclay. In other words, producing photoglyphic engravings required a mixture of experimental practice-based knowledge from both Talbot and experts in printing, so it was an amalgamation of both of these expertise. Moreover, the experimental practice that Talbot employed to develop his engraving process was very similar to the practice he applied when developing his positive-negative process. He started his photoglyphic experiments by applying the practice he had developed with his photogenic drawings, by placing the subject directly on the photographic emulsion. Here we see a direct positive of the famous dandelions image, before trying to reproduce photoglyphic plates made from paper positives. Some of them, you'll see, weren't as successful as others. And, as we've seen, by 1851, he was using the process recently developed by Frederick Scott Archer of glass positives for the subjects of his plates. So photoglyphs could be made from metal, from paper, glass, and any other positive form. Talbot's process for producing a photographic print was a continuation, not a departure from his previous photographic research. It was a process that sought out the most recent advances in photochemistry and printing to create stable and mass-reproducible images. Talbot's desire in the early 1850s for a photographic printing process, which would create images that would not easily fade and which could be reproduced on a large scale, was reflective of some of his recent experiences he had in printing positives for commercial audiences. In the mid-1840s, Talbot supported one of his household servants, Nicholas Henneman, to set up a photographic printing establishment in Reading, UK. Henneman was tasked with two large-scale printing projects. The first of these was the printing of photographs for Talbot's The Pencil of Nature, which was intended to showcase the value and beauty of his invention. Talbot and his subscribers soon realized, however, that one of the flaws of publishing calotype positives on this scale was they were liable to fade pretty quickly. This is a photograph of Patroclus, taken from Pencil of Nature. In the same period, Henneman was asked to produce 6,000 photographic prints for an issue of the Art Union, which overtaxed the production capacity of the Reading establishment, resulting in delayed schedule and poor quality prints. From the first decade following the announcement of the photographic process, Talbot was keen to utilize the traditional sites of scientific and cultural communication of the mid-19th century, the book and the periodical press, to legitimize his invention to a broad public. Print publication, in other words, were intermeshed with the story of the invention of photography. One further event occurred in 1850, which may have compelled, in the early 1850s, which may have compelled Talbot to develop his engraving process. From spring to autumn 1851, the Great Exhibition took place in Hyde Park in London. This was an enormous and very popular performance of the cultural, scientific, technological, and political power of Britain and its empire, which aimed to display all the best international works of science, art, and industry under one roof. The Great Exhibition included, among many other technologies, a display of the best photographic processes of the 1850s. Photography, however, was also key to demonstrating the diversity and value of technologies on display at the exhibition after it closed. The managers of the Great Exhibition, which included Prince Albert, the husband to Queen Victoria, produced 4 volumes of the reports of the juries of the Great Exhibition, which are lavish, big publications, which were to be illustrated with approximately 160 tipped-in photographic positive prints. Talbot was keen that Henneman would get the commission to photograph the exhibits and produce the prints for the reports. However, as Anthony Hamber has recently detailed in his forthcoming book on photography and the Great Exhibition, Henry Cole, who's the manager of the Great Exhibition and later first director of the South Kensington Museum, which is also the origins of both the V&A and the Science Museum, for which my museum comes from, decided against commissioning Henneman and rather turned to the amateur photographer Hugh Owen and 2 French photographers, Frederic von Martens and Claude-Marie Ferrier, to produce a series of glass plate albumen prints for the reports. Hamber has suggested that there might have been a number of reasons why the Committee for the Great Exhibition refused to give Henneman the contract to produce paper photographs for the reports, including personal conflict between Talbot and some members of the committee. But he has also suggested that Henneman's prints were also too dark and of poor quality. The failure for Henneman and Talbot was, ultimately, a failure of printing, the inability of Henneman to produce large, reliably good quality photographic prints. By the early 1850s, there were a number of reasons why Talbot would have desired an effective process for printing his photographs in ink rather than photochemically. Fading and photographs were both a problem for the credibility of his photographic process and had significant impact on his and Henneman's capacity to gain and maintain commercial contracts. But we also have to remember that paper photographs for Talbot, from its point of invention, was valued as a technology that could be used to print and reproduce other images. Talbot and Henneman produced negatives and positives of a range of different printed images throughout the 1840s. In the Talbot collection in the National Science and Media Museum, we have, for example, a salt print from the 1840s of a wood engraving titled Johannes Jacobus Saxurius, which was originally carved in wood by the 18th century engraver Joseph Nutting. We also have a salt print of an aquatint produced by Jacob Sutter titled Passage de Vengonap, a salt print of a lithograph depicting the Church of All Saints in Seville, Spain, and a salt print of an etching, which is itself based on a 17th century painting titled St. Francis of Assisi by Bartolomeu Esteban Murillo. As we can see, both Talbot and Henneman produced photographic copies of earlier printing technologies which were used for different purposes. For example, both the etching and the lithograph displayed here were printed by Henneman for the inclusion in William Sterling's volume, Annals of the Artists of Spain. This is a printed volume which includes 66 Talbot-type prints of Spanish works of arts, so reproductions of other reproductions. The early use of Talbot's photographic process, as we can see, was intermeshed in a relationship with earlier forms of print reproduction. This relationship, moreover, was not just representational. When it came to developing his process for photoglyphic engraving, Talbot would borrow the techniques developed by engravers and printers, particularly the techniques of etching and aquatint. For those that don't know, aquatint is a process of applying a layer of ground resin to the top of an etching. This gives it a greater tonal resolution to the image, which Talbot also experimented with, adding aquatint to his etchings to create better photoglyphs. The chemical and inked photograph are, in other words, difficult to disentangle from each other in the 1840s as well as in the decades following. Towards a conclusion, looking at Talbot's work in photographic printing can help us contextualize the meaning of photography both in the 19th and the 20th century, as the medium underwent large shifts in what photography was made to do. By looking at the mixed relationship between different forms of photography and printing methods, we can move away from the idea that photography itself is self-contained. This perspective is reflected in the recent book by Michelle Henning, Photography, the Unfettered Image, where she argues that a history of photography cannot be anything other than partial, since photography as a category encompasses many different methods and technical apparatus, none of which can be considered purely photographic. By thinking about the relationship between photography and print, we can incorporate and recontextualize the range of photographic practitioners in the 19th century who were inventing and applying photochemistry to printing technologies. So again, we can bring back people such as Nicephore Niepce, Hippolyte Fizeau, Alphonse Louise Potvin, Walter Woodbury, Paul Pretsch, or Carol Click, among many others, into the central canon of the history of photography. By including a capacious understanding of the history of photography, where no medium is purely photographic, we can also include images that at first glance don't look like photographs at all. Most historians of photography include the three engraved photogenic drawings reproduced in the April 27, 1839 issue of the Magazine of Science and the School of Arts. These depict three photogenic drawings reproduced on wood by the naturalist George William Francis. In both subject and shading, these images look photographic, despite that they were made by exposing the negative on a wood block and then engaging an engraver to carve out the lines of the image by tracing the photographic exposure, thereby making an inked print possible, a wood engraving of a photograph. What we don't often look at, however, is the photogenic drawing reproduced in the next issue, possibly because these images don't look photographic. If it wasn't for the subtitle of the article which accompanies these images, we would identify these as wood engravings, having little to do with photography, but these are again reproduced from photographs. But what do we lose by overlooking photographs like these? As I've argued in my recent book, for the period between 1850 and 1890, most photographs reproduced in print looked like engravings, such as this photograph of an eclipse captured by the Manchester photographer and astronomer Alfred Brothers, which reproduced an image, which was reproduced as a wood engraving in an illustrated science periodical, Nature, in 1871. Many of these images were understood by contemporary audiences to be photographic, or at least to have come from a photograph. By focusing on Talbot's positive-negative photography rather than the whole range of his scientific and photographic experimental work, we also miss the point that Talbot's research was a fundamental step in making photomechanical images possible. Talbot's photoglyphic engraving process, which would be adapted by Carol Click to invent photogravure, which is itself the predecessor of offset lithography, which is currently one of the most important forms of modern commercial printing. Investigating the photoglyphic engraving collection at the National Science and Media Museum, moreover, you can see how much Talbot's research was influenced by, and in turn influenced future forms of mass image reproduction technologies. In the collection, you will find, for example, this veil, this glass plate negative of a veil, and this photoglyphic engraving of a veil. These objects represent Talbot's experiments whereby he attempted to break up the tone of a photographic print by using the small intersecting lines of the mesh of the veil. In other words, he was developing the concept that would be applied from the 1890s onwards of the half-tone dot. Photography, I want to argue, is very much printmaking. and we need to start thinking about ink and chemistry as interrelated photographic processes. Thank you.